Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to another episode of the Daily Friend Show. I'm your host, Nicholas Lorimer, and today I'm joined by our other Lion of the East Rand, Mr. Bheki Mahlobo. How are you doing, sir?
Doing well yourself. I was trying to do a lion roar. I sucked at it. Doing well, Nick. How are you doing, Hermann?
And of course, yes, but the other person we have is Mr. Hermann Pretorius, our agent in Pretoria. Hermann, how are you? Good. So we've got lots of energy for today's show. That's always good. We do apologize if you hear a sort of slight whirring in the background. Becky's mics are not all quite working exactly as they should be. But the demands of news and the cause of liberty there's no hesitation. We must go forward boldly with what we have. Anyway, speaking of the news and the cause of liberty, there is a word on the lips of many economists around the world. And South Africa is no exception, and that is inflation. So everyone who was alive then probably remembers the dark days of inflation in the 70s, and at least in America in the early 80s, and in South Africa the 80s, we definitely had inflation. And it looks like after having very low inflation during the pandemic, the annual inflation rate in South Africa has accelerated for a second consecutive month to 5% in September of 2021, up from 4.9% the previous month. This is in line with previous expectations, so it's not a huge shock. But we are starting to see its effects in a big way. One of the notable things is that I think at the end of this month, there are estimates that fuel might go up as much as R1. And paraffin, which of course many poor people use to light their homes, is going to go up by, I think, R1.50 per litre. So this is not great. 95 octane petrol last month reached an all-time high of 18 Rand 34 cents per litre. And yeah, we're seeing pretty much rising prices across all of the sectors that really affect people's lives: electricity, fuel, rent, food, as well as oils, fats, and meat, which is something that separates us from the people of the Middle Ages, is that we actually get to enjoy meat. So it's not great when that price goes up. Becky, what do you make of this? What am I missing out on, and why is it happening?
Yeah, Nick, I think a great starting point would be to actually look at essentially what central bankers around the world have been saying about inflation, because inflation is looked at when determining monetary policy action, whether to increase interest rates that in an attempt will try to lessen inflation, or to keep interest rates where they are. And the common mantra that I've been hearing from central banks around the world is that inflation is transitory. In other words, it's only short term, and then a few months or a year later, everything will settle down to low levels. That does not appear to be the case, as with every single week, we see that there's a new inflation story. This week, it's an increase in fertilizer prices, which unfortunately negatively harms farmers that rely on fertilizers for crops. In South Africa's case, I think the best way to explain inflation is that it's a hidden tax. It's a hidden tax, particularly on the poor. If you recall, during the July riots, one of the triggers for those riots was firstly massive levels of unemployment, poverty levels, decline in social economic well-being of South Africans, but as well as that of increases in food prices. Those are trigger points where essentially you would see an increase in rioting actions, not only here in South Africa, but at the same time we also saw that in Cuba. Now, we do fortunately have a sensible central bank, and solely an independent central bank, and the governor, Lesetja Kganyago, is very wise when we compare him to other central banks around the world, and does see that this is a point of concern. He does understand the relationship between inflation and that of the poor in the country. For this, I'm particularly talking about the talk he had about 2 weeks ago. Inflation is now currently at about 5%. Main contributing factors to that is the increase in fuel. which you said there, you noted there, Nick. Fuel's now about like $85 to the dollar, which is practically very massive. It's largely been offset by the appreciation in the rand. South African rand did appreciate, but we still do feel the negative impacts of the increase in fuel price. Now, I do assume that the Central Bank of South Africa will start to then increase interest rates, be it this in November or the following months ahead, in order to curb inflation in the country. Yeah, it's negative for the poor and negatively impacts the poor.
Very much so. And I this is not just a South African story, of course. The US is also experiencing inflation, which their central bank or their Federal Reserve, as they call it, sort of said, no, don't worry, guys. It's transitory. It'll just be a temporary blip, and then it'll be gone, and keeps coming back. So we do look like we might be in for a little bit of a period of inflation. Herman, what do you make of all this? I see someone in the comments here suggesting that we should cue up Darth Vader's theme before you speak, which I think is actually kind of appropriate because you have a dark aura about you today.
Yeah, no, it's well, Mozart's Requiem will work better. It's not the slow.
Less royalty fees.
Yeah, I mean, it's not the slow march of conquering. It's just a sad lament of demise. If you're hearing something that sounds like a dog trying to get into a room, don't worry, it's just a dog trying to get into a room. So the frustrating thing is that the inflation crisis was really predictable. In fact, it was predicted. If you go look at the more Austrian economists around the world, someone like Bheki, very, very skeptical of the power of central banks and the power of a fiscal policy. Not fiscal policy, monetary policy. If you want to have cheap money because you want to spend a lot and you loosen monetary discipline, inevitably, I mean, it just spikes inflation. And the question was, I'm just baffled. I'm genuinely baffled. It is partly just because of frustration with their ideological underpinnings, but it's also partly just ignorance on my side. I'm not an economist, but I'm baffled by how some of the really top central banking figures in the world, like Janet Yellen in the United States, how they thought they could make money cheaper to support a big spending platform happening across the world and almost every major economy, even here, without affecting inflation on a more toxic, sustainable basis when we have the interest rate scenario that we have around the world.
It's worth talking about how things have changed in the last 10 years. 10 years ago, we had sort of conservative governments in Britain saying, we've got to do austerity to make sure that our finances don't get out of control. And the newly emerged Tea Party in the US was demanding reining in spending and criticizing the Obama administration for supporting big spending hikes. And now you've got the US sort of going, yeah, well, if we spend sort of $5 trillion, which is, the most ever spent. I mean, they've got two bills currently in the legislative process, and they both look like they're going to fail currently. But even the smaller one will be the largest spending package ever in American history by a long way. And, it's kind of interesting that just as inflation seems to sort of be returning to the world after many years of there not being that much of it, Bheki will correct me if I'm wrong, we're seeing intellectual currents for ideas like modern monetary theory kind of playing around. And it's crazy because modern monetary theory, now it's not, as our colleague Gable Krauser will point out, it's not something that you can actually just dismiss entirely sort of with the wave of your hand. But the net result is craziness, especially if you're a country like South Africa. And we're already starting to see sort of policy analysts saying modern monetary theory, which in a sense basically says if you are printing money and you have your debt in your own currency, then you can just print as much as you like, make money as cheap as you like, and there'll be no negative consequences because you can just reduce inflation by taxation. Good
Yeah,
luck with that.
just a point there, just to further add to the point that you make, Nick, as well as Herman, is that with the quantum of stimulus that we've seen in the past 2 years, there hasn't been that much increase in economic output in these countries, which is quite concerning because you have a massive pump of stimulus measures, which does result in increased debt levels.
Right. That's
And
the
like,
whole point of stimulus, right? Is to
Yeah.
increase productivity.
that's the point of stimulus measures. Yeah, the mainstream view of stimulus is that you pump up money in order to essentially increase economic output in the country. Whereas that's not the case. Even quite recently, the IMF came out and warned of inflationary pressures and revised down GDP growth figures for the world in general. So unfortunately, we're heading towards a period of stagflation where we'll unfortunately see higher price levels, and lower levels of economic output. And I think another point to highlight here is essentially the deviation of the blame by governments around the world, particularly in the US as well as in Europe. They're not blaming the increase in prices, be it shipping containers, be it fertilizers, on the increased money spending on increased money supply. They're rather blaming it on supply bottlenecks. And of course, that does have a play in it when you're looking at semiconductors and so forth. But any form of inflation starts with the printing of money. And who is the first person to print money? It is governments. I see this particularly within the US administration, particularly Biden administration. I think it was like a week or 2 weeks ago, blamed the increases in prices in meat on meat producers, saying that they're price gouging. That's not particularly the case. It's just them printing money, which is the thing that governments tend to do whenever there's high inflation. They just blame private businesses.
And just one thing I want to say is I see someone in the comments just typed Trump with 3 exclamation marks. I mean, if only. Trump expanded the US debt significantly.
Trump was the biggest spender. Yeah.
Yes, I think by something like 35 or 36%, he expanded the debt of the US. So while he did have a very successful, tax cut policy, and it was the biggest tax overall in the US for 40 years, there wasn't concordant cutting of expenditure. In fact, it was ramped up in many areas. So I must say that sadly, when you look across the world, Trump promised to lower the deficit. Boris Johnson promised to lower the deficit. Even Tutu Mboweni talked about lowering the deficit, eliminating the deficit.
Yeah,
some of them, I think, is Trump.
It's a song and
they
dance.
come in with these great policies, but everyone ceases to be a monetarist when they reach office, because they absolutely just lose their mind and their fiscal discipline. It's just easier to spend.
Sorry, this is a problem. Yeah, sure. Go ahead. Bheki.
Sorry, Herman just lubricated my intellectual juices on this topic. This is a point that Herman makes a very significant point, and I think it's a point that's largely not talked about the Trump administration, right? Yes, there were successful avenues that Trump did in terms of economic growth, employment levels, as well as tax cuts. But what's often missed is that Trump was a huge spender. In order to have a successful, essentially conservative government, you'd need to actually spend less than what you receive in tax revenue. And that's not particularly the case that what Trump did. He actually spent more than what he received in tax revenue, which increased debt levels in the US, which then got picked up by the Biden administration. This is not the Biden administration.
This is something that's been going on for 20 years now, across the world, of people coming in saying, "Oh man, this debt thing is a real problem. We need to get it under control. We're going to every single major world leader says we're going to get spending under control," and then goes back on.
And it never does. And I see Vut Zarko or whatever saying it's TDS, Trump derangement. I would have voted for Trump were I an American voter in the previous election. To just blame things on some sort of derangement syndrome is just simply uncritical. I think he made excellent appointments to the Supreme Court: Neil Gorsuch, Brett Kavanaugh, Amy Coney Barrett. I think he cut federal regulations on business significantly. I think he did good deals with the Abrahamic Peace Accords, the first peace accords in the Middle East since 1994. I think he actually did good stuff. But my goodness, if you criticize one part of the Trump legacy, suddenly it's back to the binary nonsense of 2020. It really,
You can see that Herman's still got terrible flashbacks from the past. Anyway,
I've got terrible flashbacks from the Georgia Senate runoff elections, but that's a whole different
let's not get
thing.
sidetracked now, because if we do get sidetracked, we're never going to get to anything else. Anyway, okay, so yeah, inflation not good. It's going up. Governments being very irresponsible with spending and printing and all that kind of stuff. Speaking of people being irresponsible,
might I add a final thing? People should be very aware of this across the world. And Bheki mentioned hidden tax. I think that's exactly right. Inflation is a form of a hidden tax, but that's the government shtick always. They always, if they want to spend, they never cut expenditure elsewhere. They sort of pick off minor taxes, things not often called a tax. Like a national insurance contribution or something like that, and they just boost it a bit. And the problem is, it's really, the world is heavily taxed, and it's not helping. It is really just spectacular how you can look at the correlation between global economic performance and the global collective tax burden, and just see this inverse correlation. And I'm just really frustrated that you have to be really intelligent to be that stupid.
It's the expropriation of purchasing power. I think that's the best way to explain.
Right. Yeah. And it punishes saving, and that's something that South
Exactly.
Africa really has a problem with. We do not have a lot of savings, and this is only going to make that worse. Anyway, before you all stepped on my transition there, speaking of people being irresponsible, NUMSA, the South African National Metal Worker, the National Union of Metal Workers of South Africa, sorry. We talked very briefly about their sort of declining power a couple of episodes ago, but the strike that they're currently embarking on is rolling on. They've recently rejected a wage offer which was offered by the Steel Engineering Industries Federation of South Africa. They proposed 6%, which is above, even despite the fact that inflation is now at around 5%, that's still 1% above inflation. And NUMSA is continuing to go on with their strike. Bheki, what are the sort of issues at play here? I've seen, I think, on our sort of sister channel and the CRA that there's more behind this NUMSA strike than simply just economics.
Yeah, there's a lot going on. Just to provide a little bit of context, as you might have noticed there, sorry, Herman needs a Trump mug. Just to provide a little bit of context, this relates also to the commodity rally that we saw in the past year. I've seen false analysis that came from Business Day, not particularly from Business Day, but a columnist from Business Day, suggesting that the increase in the steel price has favorable effects on steel manufacturers here in the country. That is flawed because steel is used as an input cost to produce steel products by South African manufacturers, of which I've responded to that particular op-ed in Business Day. So that's in addition to other costs, actually. So whenever there's an increase in the steel price, it negatively impacts South African manufacturers, in addition to load shedding and the decline of Eskom's electricity generation, and having an economy that shows no levels of significant growth levels in the foreseeable years and so forth. So unfortunately here, what we're seeing is that the steel manufacturers are being demonized by trade unions. And I think this is a huge problem that the country faces in terms of trade unions in the country. This is not in a way to say that we don't need trade unions. I do think that there is a level that trade unions can play. However, what we're currently seeing right now is the demonization of private businesses in the country. Now, in relation to the NUMSA rejection of the wage proposed by CIFA of about 6%, they want, I think, a segment of close to 10%, which is massive. Not all steel manufacturers will be able to afford that price level, particularly the small and medium enterprises. That will be largely impacted by the wage settlements between NUMSA and CIFA. And if it does occur that wages are settled at very high levels and these businesses cannot afford those wage settlements, unfortunately, we'll see the closing down of small and medium enterprises and the retrenchment of thousands of jobs. When you already have about 10 million people unemployed in this country, very weak labor market, which is very unfortunate.
Herman, your thoughts? This just seems to be a story we always are playing around with in South Africa, of unions being, shall we say, not equal partners in the success of our economy.
Yeah, I mean, but there's if there is a silver lining to this, it's that the unions are just hastening their own irrelevance by killing the industries that they are reliant on in their existence in the first place. I mean, the production hell through which manufacturing across the world has gone over the last year. I can see the sort of Machiavellian idea of let's punch them while they're down. But there's a real chance that these sort of nonsense is just, choking the life out of sectors that actually might have some chutzpah left in a recovery that we might want to expect over the next decade. But there is something quite sinister in what's going on here, where there's this ideological double talk where on the one hand, we have corporations with relative freedom to act in South Africa, so that gives this idea of capitalism. On the other hand, we have governments picking winners and losers within sectors, and also we have big business willing to, as Bheki points out, sacrifice smaller competition. So what we have in South Africa is not a form of capitalism, nor is it a form of socialism. It's actually the worst combination of the two, and it's just called crony capitalism, where you have a select few of commercial elites growing not through healthy value-add competition to dominant positions in the markets, but just by them remaining static or relatively static with their market slice, but ensuring that the circumstances become so hostile for any emergent competitor that they can't really challenge this dominance. And that, in the long run, actually pushes up prices, causing a sort of inflationary spike. So if you're going to interrupt, so on the topic of inflation, we've got the problem of bad fiscal discipline globally and in South Africa, bad monetary discipline globally in South Africa, the disruption of supply chains on the back of COVID-19, then the further disruptions in South Africa by strikes in Eskom, and then also the longer term unhealthy inflationary seed planting of market non-value add market domination by companies that really have no interest in driving down prices for the sake of the consumer, because they know as long as they can cover their costs as demanded by government-allied trade unions, they can continue squeezing out competitors and eking out a profit at the top. And that's going to make what they produce more expensive in the long term. So at every step of the way, you're just making life more expensive for the people who can afford it least.
Bheki, any final thoughts before we move on?
Yeah, so I've spoken to a few steel manufacturers, and particularly they were largely firstly impacted by the lockdown measures, pandemic as well, because there wasn't a lot of construction occurring, right? As well as the second thing that impacted them was the riots in July. And now what's currently happening with wage settlements between NUMSA and SIFA. And I've seen estimates that this has largely cost the steel industry about 500 million rands, according to Bloomberg. And unfortunately, if this does carry on for a long period of time, it's the closure of these businesses, unfortunately. I do recall that there was a point in time which small and medium enterprises were seen as the beacon for employment, for new employment in the country. Unfortunately, the policies, as well as, I guess, the segments of trade between trade unions, as well as that of big business, are actually putting red tape on small businesses and medium businesses in the country. So it does not look good. The picture does not look good.
Indeed. All right. Let us move on to the last story for today. And I must admit, My original idea for this was just to introduce the topic and then have us all laugh obnoxiously for about 5 minutes. But we'll spare you that because I think that would be a little bit overkill. But President Cyril Ramaphosa has vowed that we will not protect any ANC leader accused of corruption. At a signing of a memorandum, a code of conduct that all, I think most political parties do this, but I know the ANC and the DA both do this. Or ANC councillors in Alberton were signing this accountability pledge where they promise to serve their communities and not be corrupt and just generally do good stuff. Ramaphosa was speaking at this event in Alberton. Hermann? Yeah, so Ramaphosa here. Does he have any credibility?
I know he said we wouldn't laugh, but my goodness, the temptation is massive. I mean, this is the guy who said, in 2014-15 that he would end load shedding. This is the guy who said he would create 600,000 jobs in election. I mean, he has no credibility, none whatsoever. But the real sad thing is, we're devoting the last few minutes of this show to corruption, this topic. And as far as the media and much of the public are concerned, this is the thing that has killed South Africa. Corruption is the thing that has killed South Africa. And I'm afraid to say that's nonsense. Corruption has kicked us while we're down, but if we've lost a few billion or a few 100 billion, whatever, to corruption over the last decade and a half, we've lost trillions to bad policy, to investment going to every other country except South Africa, because over our parking garage where we try to get people to park, we've just said, when you park here, your car might not be yours when you get back. We've said, park your car here, but we're going to give a bit of it away to people we prefer along racial lines. So as terrifying and as horrible as corruption is, and as laughable as an ANC president talking anti-corruption rhetoric is, there's a real sadness in me that it gets this hype. It gets this hype that if only we stop corruption, if only we arrest all the corrupt, cadres, and then the economy will come roaring back. When the first 2/3 of today's episode, we actually spent talking about some of the more important things that killing our country, not just the vulture type ideas that hang around for the little scraps of meat that the devouring hyenas leave over. It's really so tragic that of every issue in the country, inflation is getting so little airtime while corruption is seen as, the great evil. It's an evil, yeah, but it's a sidekick to what's really going on. And that's a government so big that it can demand anything of the taxpayer and anything of business. And when business and taxpayers have the freedom to say, hang on, I think I'm not going to dance to your tune, then pretty soon the big status band starts playing to a very empty room.
Bheki, anything to add?
Just a few. It's the real corruption is EWC, real corruption is NHI, real corruption is BEE, real corruption is employment equity. Real corruption is the way in which the ANC is currently thinking. That's the real corruption that's currently stealing from the poorest of the poor and businesses in the country. That's the point that Cyril Ramaphosa should speak towards to. None of this fidgeting around the edges, which he's very good at doing. The president is very good at highlighting a certain point that doesn't really matter in the grand scheme of things and ignoring everything else. And that's what we're currently seeing here, is that there's not really a move towards a better South African if we remove corruption. It's just more of the same way of thinking. And really what Herman touched on there is that corruption is a symptom of the bigger issue. The symptom is that the way in which the ANC currently thinks, as of currently, is very flawed and results in massive levels of corruption in the country.
Exactly. But also, just to emphasize the point that you guys have been making, South Korea, pretty well-run country, has developed pretty much faster than anyone else in the world. Lots of great successes there. They've had presidents arrested for corruption. They have quite a lot of corruption in their government. But they still keep on going because they've got a lot of good ideas and the framework of their government is not completely garbage. They're not trapped in an ideological prison from the 1960s like our government is. Anyway.
I mean, you're being very kind with the 1960s. I would say 1950s at best.
1860s, maybe. Anyway, that's all the time we have for today. Please support the Institute of Race Relations, which is the great malevolent force behind the Daily Friend, pumping our propaganda into your ears. And it's also a great think tank. So please go to the IRA's website, ira.org.za, and click the Join Us button to sign up as a donor and a friend of the Institute. Anyway, we will see you tomorrow, and we hope that you have a most excellent day, everyone. Cheers.